the master system of the NEL was one of the coolest aspects of it to me. We'd already had a glimpse into the difference between the pros and Blue Lock at the end of season 1, but now not only are we seeing the absolute best in the world play, more importantly, we also get a real look into their minds, how they think, how they see both football and the world. Now in this video, I'm not really going to talk about their skill as players because that's a very boring, quick discussion. Instead, we're going to be ranking them by how good of a mentor they were, both in terms of how much their players benefited from them and just, my own personal opinion of their philosophies as a random 25-year-old bloke. Starting off with Chris Prince, because there's a ton to talk about here. I know some people are just going to point to the fact that Manshine lost every game, but I don't think that fairly covers everything that's happened. In his first introduction, he seems to just be a bit of a musclehead. And don't get me wrong, the whole feeling everyone's muscles to determine what type of player they are is kinda sus. But his actual advice to the players is some of my favourite. Firstly, talent without self-awareness will wither away. i.e., we should understand how and why we've been able to succeed in the past. Yearning for power without understanding your talent's mechanism will cause your talent to wither away. The example he gives is of a sprinter wanting the power of a tank. Training to become that would cause them to lose their speed, their weapon, as such. It's not that working on your weaknesses is bad, but that you shouldn't try to become something that you're not. This is obviously very in line with some of the very first things Jinpachi taught the Blue Lockers, his emphasis on reproducibility and having a weapon that you understand and use as part of a formula. And I think about this a lot because it's so easy to be drawn into a billion different things and want to do them all. Or you feel like you're missing out on the ideal way to do something. And before you know it, you're either constantly stressing that you're not doing it the best way or you're jumping from one pursuit to another. And then, before you know it, you're chasing something that you don't even really care about but are just doing it because you've heard that you should. But Prince essentially tells them to have the confidence that their own weapon and own style of play is not only enough, but is exactly what they should focus on. That sticking with it will lead to the best results, as opposed to this kind of shiny object syndrome of jumping from one thing to another. In 175, he asks Rio, what kind of player do you want to be? And specifically tells him not to think too hard about it, to just let his purest gut instinct answer it, instead of letting logic get in the way and influence what he thinks he should or could do. Just simply, how would your ideal Rio Mikage answer? What kind of player do you want to be? Not what do you think you should do, in contrast to the approach Japanese football seems to take, according to Jinpachi and Aiku, of pigeonholing the players into certain roles and playstyles. Prince instead offers them the freedom to pursue whatever they want, provided that they are able to clearly state it. And likewise also links to Jinpachi's speech in 247 about originality, that what you hunger for makes a person's originality, to reveal their real desire and pursue that. But my favourite thing from him is something so incredibly simple yet so instantly impactful, is when he talks about how no one, no matter how talented, can be positive all the time. Everyone has moments where they're frightened and lose confidence. And in those moments, I ask myself, rather than the current me, what would the ideal Chris Prince do? In terms of what we said at the start of just mixing the opinion of this 25-year-old bloke into the rankings, this is honestly one of the best things I've ever seen. Something about it just instantly gets me out of a rut every time I remember it. And on top of this, there's no denying that Prince genuinely cared about developing all of the players, having individual interviews and training plans for every single one of them. To him, it was more important that each of the players got a chance to develop themselves than actually win. Something I suspect Agi was irritated by, given that in 245, we see his frustration at Prince telling him to pass to Nagi. Speaking of which, it's no coincidence that when Jinpachi later called out Nagi in 299, he had the exact same aura and used the exact same word, wither, as well as all these skulls here being the same as Nagi's aura. But I spoke a lot about how this all applies to Nagi in my previous video, so I won't spend any more time on it here. But I do think that there was nothing more Prince could have done to help Nagi out. I don't see how it's his fault in the slightest, it's not like he could have known this would happen. So I don't agree at all with anyone claiming that he never should have focused on Nagi, because not only did he teach everyone, but Nagi's potential was absolutely sky high. Like, it would have been absurd if he didn't coach him at all, Also, it seems to me like it was just Agi he got to work with Nagi. I don't think it really came at the expense of any of the other Blue Lockers. I don't recall him ever telling Chigiri that he has to pass to Nagi or anything like that. I think it was just Agi, maybe some of the other Manshine U20 players. I don't think it got in the way of any of the Blue Lockers training. And also, once he'd given Nagi a more than fair chance and realised that, this just wasn't working, he then moved on and in 297 instead gave a chance to Rio, who'd clearly found his fire again, instead of Nagi, who'd continued to dawdle along despite all the help and advice he received. Likewise, I think he taught Rio extremely well and got him to finally start using some of his absurd potential. Rio did fall off track for a bit, but again, there wasn't really much Prince could do about it, besides, substituting one of them off until they stopped. And it obviously goes without saying that he did wonders for Chigiri, who, despite being on a team that lost every single game, proved himself to be a major threat. He's always been a solid player, but has now definitely shifted up a tier and will do some major damage at the U20 tournament. Now, Lavinho, I actually think I've been too harsh on this guy. So I'm going to try and give him the benefit of the doubt here. Don't get me wrong, this guy is not a contender for the #1 spot. But I previously thought, well, all he did was tell them to visualize being the best and work towards it without telling them how to get there. And that's kind of just a lame version of what Prince said. And it kind of is. However, when he says, I ain't teaching you shit about soccer, I don't think he means that literally, in that he's not going to train them. We see that he gives them all a training plan. Instead, I think he wants the players to not focus so much on their training and technique alone, but rather the kind of player that they want to be. And in the world of Blue Lock, that might actually be good advice. We've seen that a player's motivation is honestly the most important thing. For example, Rin's power-up right at the end of the U20 match after finding the right one, or Nagi's elimination as a result of lacking one. Like Prince, he tells them to imagine their ideal self, but from what we've seen of him, he gives very little one-on-one guidance from there, telling them to copy amazing guys and leaving the rest to the Blue Lockers to figure it out for themselves. However, it's pretty clear that no one except Bachara or Otia was actually able to. And honestly, it's hard to even say how much, if at all, Otia actually benefited from him, or whether he just got by on his current level of skill. We saw so little of him in the NEL that we really can't say, especially as we have no idea if the two ever had a conversation the same way Lavinho did with Bachara. Maybe there's a case to be made that for the right people he was extremely beneficial, but I think he needed to give quite a bit more guidance than he ended up doing. However, this is still a lot better than Loki, who probably should have just never been a master in the first place, honestly. At just 17 years old, he's not really got any more experience than the players he's teaching, just some of it at a higher level. It reminds me of something that was said about Gojo and JJK, I don't remember when, but essentially that he was too talented to be able to teach anyone well because he couldn't actually explain a lot of the techniques as they just came naturally to him. And I think there's a similar deal going on here with Loki. Whilst I will give him credit for seemingly being the only master to utilize the infinite substitution rules, and he clearly at least cared enough to think up 2 separate formations, I don't think he really deserves any of the credit for PXG's victories. It kind of feels like it just happened to work because he got 2 monsters in Rin and Shido on his team. Also in 246, we see that after every game he's been telling the players where to improve, which is something, but it's probably not super useful for the Blue Lockers. Rin being told to shoot more, Shido being told to score more, Zantetsu just being told to sprint more often. These are probably all valid criticisms, but without being told how and why, it's hard to see the benefit of him telling this. For example, in Zantetsu's case, when should he be sprinting more? Because it's not just going to be aimlessly running around the pitch. Like, is it on offense? Is it on defense? It didn't really give him any sort of context to it. Obviously, he only joined to grow Charles as a player, in a similar vein to Noah and Kaiser, as I'll come to. And so it kind of feels like he's just doing the bare minimum to not look as though he's neglecting everyone else. He's still obviously pretty solid as a tactical coach, but as a mentor, it doesn't feel like anyone learned a single thing from him. Not even Charles. The whole point was that he'd benefit from playing against the other players, not anything Loki himself was doing. So while some of the other mentors like Noah or Lavinho could be seen as beneficial for the right players, I don't think Loki was beneficial for anyone. And speaking of Noah, he's probably the one that people disagree on the most in terms of how good of a master he is. On the one hand, he actually has some pretty solid advice. I really like the way he tells Isagi to break everything down step by step, working backwards from the goal, making sure he's able to verbalize each part of it rather than leaving it to chance. I've actually sat down and done this a few times with various things. It's genuinely really useful. It's a great way to figure out exactly what it is he's lacking and how to improve on it. He also gives Isagi a pretty brutal reality check when he asks him, if you had everything you're trying to get, could you beat me? Which seemed to really open Isagi's eyes, pun not intended, that his current thinking was simply too small for the stage he's trying to stand on. I also like the part where he asks Isagi if every step he's taking is actually getting him closer to where he wants. And again, going back to the perspective of just a 25-year-old chap, I really like this. It's another one of those things like with Chris Prince, where whenever I remember it, it's like an almost instant change in my brain. And it doesn't have to be taken literally as in working towards one thing every second of every day, but rather that in the time where you are working towards something, is what you're doing actually beneficial or not? There's some obvious things like if you say you're going to study for an hour, checking your phone in that hour isn't going to help you. But then there's also some less obvious ones where it's easy to convince yourself you're being productive when you're really not. And you're probably just doing it because it's a less difficult task. Like again, if you're studying and you're just doing the topics you already know, or spending ages picking what font you want to use for your notes or something, it links back to that last point of, if you had everything you're trying to get, could you beat me? But instead it's more like, if you did this thing, will you actually get what you want? I went into a lot more detail about it in this video here, but he does actually have some really solid advice. It's just that he didn't really give it out to anyone except Isagi when he went out of his way to ask him. And sure, it's cool that Isagi showed initiative, but also he should have actually taught the others something. You know, you can't just say, well, they should have gone and asked him, like that's kind of his role here. But anyway, as a coach, he's certainly not the worst, especially for someone as logically minded as Isagi. His emphasis on data gave them all something very tangible and clear to work on. Also, his team did obviously win every game. Again, I don't think that's really that much to do with him. It's not like he gave his team any strategies or anything. Obviously, yeah, he made the occasional good tactical decision like putting Kunigami in as a defender, or of course bringing on Negaguri to stop her in, but for the most part, his team didn't really directly benefit from him. Even Isagi would have gotten minimal gain if he hadn't asked him at the start of the NEL. Finally, Mark Snuffy, my favourite character in the entire series, and is arguably the most important one for how he balances out a lot of Blue Lock's ideas. However, before we get into that, I want to quickly talk about the sponsor of today's video in Figgyz. If you ever tried to buy like anime figures before, you know that they're very expensive and they also take up a lot of space. Figgyz solve both these issues and have a ton of cool features to them. They're much smaller and more affordable, and even if you don't have shelf space, the little figures can either go in your fridge, and you get a magnetic sticker to apply to either your walls or whatever you'd like. You get a double-sided back which you can attach the figure to for a cool 3D look, and also have a percentage chance of getting a bronze, silver or gold, which also feel amazing. They have a really nice weight to them. Each one also has a personalized QR code which you can scan with your phone to register in the app to build your figure decks, which has so many features I don't even really have time to go through them all here. But yeah, I mean, when these guys reached out to me a few months ago, I was really impressed by just how much thought they put into it all. And having now got the samples themselves, I'm really impressed by the quality of them. So if you want to check these out yourself, check the link down below to sign up for the pre-order, and a huge thank you to Figgyz for sponsoring this video. Returning to Blue Lock, we finally have Snuffy. It should be pretty obvious with the number of videos I've made on it, that I really do love a lot of the underlying messages in Blue Lock. I think Kaneshiro has been very careful not to let any of these ideas cross the line into being too edgy or just weird and cringe, but regardless, just Jinpachi's view alone has always had some holes in. For instance, he talks a lot in the first episode about how strikers should live entirely for their own goals, and should care about nothing but being the absolute best. But not everyone's going to be capable of that, and even those who are will inevitably be forced to retire one day. But that aside, what happens to those who put their entire worth into whether or not they become the best when they don't reach it? We've seen the extreme case in Nick Moon, but there's also Hiyori's parents who should have felt immensely proud of their achievements at coming second in the country at their respective sports, but they didn't. It continued to twist and torment them throughout their adulthood. There's clearly a balance to be struck somewhere, Aiming higher is obviously cool, and we've seen the Blue Lockers achieve things that they never would have otherwise. They've completely transformed their lives as a result of that, but how do we balance that with not losing our minds in the process if it doesn't work out? When Snuffy is first introduced in chapter 214, he asks the Blue Lockers, "What is football to all of you?" And they respond essentially along the lines of, "Everything, my entire life." But to Snuffy, it's just a job. He'd also later tell Barrow that before you are a player, you're just a person. There's a clear distinction in Snuffy's mind between his worth as a man and his results in football. And as a side point, obviously we know that in Kaiser's mind, his worth is purely his results. I spoke about that in my hour-long video on him, but in addition to some of the meltdowns we've seen him had when his throne was at risk, it's going to be really interesting to see how he handles himself and where he goes from the events at the end of the NEL. But Snuffy never tells Barrow not to aim higher. He simply asks him to consider what he'll do if it doesn't work out. If he'll still be able to love himself when he's no longer seen as a prodigy. To Snuffy, those who overvalue their talent, who see it as anything more than just a gift from their parents, will forever be amateurs. He sees this kind of mindset as necessary, as something required to deal with the inevitable failures on the way to the top. And obviously we saw what happened to Barrow back when he wasn't able to handle failure at all. It caused him to become a shadow of the player we know him to be. Again, I've spoken a lot more about Snuffy in this video here, but I absolutely adore his mindset, and I think it was a much needed reminder for myself at the time of reading it. I do actually have a couple small criticisms of him though. Firstly, and this is quite a minor one, whilst his strategies were very clearly top notch, I got the impression that a lot of his tactics were quite specific to that starting lineup. Obviously they'll still kind of be able to use them in future. There is of course the part in 227, following Barrow's rebellion, that Aiku says, "We can come up with a pattern using the countless tactics Snuffy poured into our heads." But the team was still almost entirely the same at that point. You can hopefully see the point I'm making here in that if we throw, let's say, Nico into an entirely new team, the coordinated team strategies he'd learnt will have some use in coming up with his own ideas, but he won't really be able to execute any of the ones based on the entire team working together with specific players. And that was quite a big part of Uber's approach, in comparison to Prince, who was more about the formula approach that Jinpachi mentioned, where the players could be thrown into any team and find a way to reproduce a goal. Snuffy even says in his first introduction, "Just execute these plans and you'll win." And I think Barrow's criticism of this in 227 is extremely valid, that whilst his team might be outstanding, it lacks despair. Throughout Blue Lock, the players' biggest spikes in abilities have come from when their backs have been up against the wall. That impulse of losing here has some consequences is precisely what has made the Blue Lock players into what they are today. Obviously one of Snuffy's biggest points is that there's a balance here, and I'll come to that shortly. However, the whole point of the NEL, as Batra points out in 169, wasn't really to win these matches. That's not actually that important. What matters is to make a case for your own worth, and of course to improve your own worth. And I can't help but feel that in comparison to Chris Prince, who really went all in on just trying to nurture these players as much as possible, even if it meant losing, that Snuffy is maybe a little overprotective, dragging them back into that exact mindset which has caused Japanese football to stagnate, of "Don't worry if we lose, it will all be my responsibility, just fulfill your role." However, I've kind of made it sound like Prince was more long-term, Snuffy was more short-term, but I think that's only really true in terms of their abilities as players. I think a lot of what he says was super important for them as individuals, in terms of their mindsets for the rest of their lives, for the reasons we spoke about earlier, especially Barrow, of course. I also obviously haven't even mentioned Lorenzo. How on earth he transformed this random homeless kid into the best U20 defender in the world is beyond me. It almost makes me wonder if it really was random, or whether he knew something about Lorenzo in advance. Like, is Snuffy just going around asking every homeless kid he sees if he can play football? I can kind of see him doing that, to be fair. Maybe we'll get a team at some point that's just his students. So with all of that in mind, getting into the final rankings as such, I think it's pretty clear that in terms of as a mentor, we've got two tiers here, with Snuffy and Prince being a long way above the other three. In terms of the bottom three, I feel pretty confident putting Loki last, honestly. Sure, he was decent as a coach, but as a mentor, I can't name a single player that actually benefited from it at all. At least with Lavinho and Noah, it's pretty clear that Batra and Isagi respectively did get quite a lot out of talking to them. But there's no one on PXG that I can say the same about with Loki. Now of course, just number of players helped might not be the best metric, because you could technically say, well, what if instead of Batra and Otia, Spain got Isagi and Nico? Then it's possible Lavinho wouldn't have helped anyone either. And I think that's a fair point, but I don't think anyone would have learned anything from Loki if they went to PXG. He literally has Zantetsu, and if anyone was a match for Loki as a student, it was him. Whereas Lavinho helped his creative players quite a bit, and Noah helped his logical players quite a bit. There's at least some degree of mentoring going on with those two. And between those two, I think it's easy enough to give third to Noah, who just had a lot more to give Isagi than Lavinho did Batra. Although neither of them really did a lot, and neither of them would have really helped anyone out if they weren't directly asked. But a lot of Noah's advice is honestly pretty solid. I really like a lot of his philosophy, and so he's a very comfortable third place for me. In terms of that aspect, I honestly don't put him very far behind the top two. Now, between these two, as a mentor to the players, I'm honestly going to give it to Chris Prince. I just feel like his one-on-one style of helping each player reach their potential was just more beneficial to their growth than Snuffy drilling strategies into their heads. Now, I know that is going to be a bit controversial, as these guys did lose every single game, and of course his decision to focus so much on Nagi did backfire, but I don't think that makes him a bad mentor. I think what he was trying to do with Nagi was brilliant and exactly what he needed. If he'd gone along with it, he wouldn't be walking home right now. You know, I don't think his failure is his fault at all. Again, Nagi literally tried the whole being creative thing once before giving up. That all said, I certainly wouldn't argue against anyone who sees Snuffy as the best mentor. Like, I completely get that some of the reasons that I've given could be interpreted and seen quite differently. In particular, how useful the strategies he drilled into them is for the player's future. But I'm essentially basing this on that if I was going to learn from a professional at a sport, if I had to choose between learning strategies from them and having personal mentoring based on my own abilities and where I want to go, I would always choose the latter. But let me know what you think down below. Thank you very much for watching. I think it's about time I do that big Isagi video, so that'll probably be next. Will probably take me a few weeks, so I'll see you guys again soon-ish for that one.